So guys, now we'll talk about the different types of APIs. Okay? So broadly speaking, there are like some 5 to 6 types of APIs. So jaldi se we'll try to get a good understanding of what each of these are. Okay? So starting off, we have something called Web API. अब ये क्या होता है? तो guys, see one thing. Each type of API ना जो भी उसका heading होगा, right? It will be almost self-explanatory. मतलब नाम देख के आपको क्लियर हो जाएगा कि एग्जैक्टली व्हाट दिस एपीआई माइट बी डूइंग और व्हाट इट इज यूज्ड फॉर, राइट? सो इट्स दैट स्ट्रेट फॉरवर्ड. Again, when we talk about web API, now see you guys understand one thing. What is an API used for? Exchange of information. आपके दिमाग में वही होना चाहिए. अगर API है, that means there is some software that is exposing its API. ठीक है? And there is some other software or some other system that is trying to access the data of that software through the API. So basically, exchange of information is happening between two different systems. This is what an API is. So with that in mind, let's try to decode what are the different types of APIs. Okay? So first up, web API. What does it mean? Well, APIs that are, as you can see here, APIs that are accessible over the web. That's it. What is a web API? Something that can be accessed over the web. And अगर web के ऊपर कुछ data exchange करना हो, what is the way we do that? There is the most appropriate way is using this HTTP protocol, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Okay, so what is HTTP? Again, अगर वेब के ऊपर, इंटरनेट के ऊपर अगर कोई मतलब अगर कुछ भी डेटा एक्सचेंज हो रहा है, वो एक्सचेंज गाइड करने के लिए ना एक तरीका होना चाहिए. वो तरीका is defined by this HTTP protocol. This states the way or the guide way in which data should be exchanged over the internet, right? Again, it allows applications to communicate over the internet, right? And data is usually shared in JSON or XML formats. So guys, ये हमने देखा है that over the internet, over the web, if data is exchanged, the most go-to format is JSON or XML formats. ठीक है? Example, you want to fetch weather or maps data from Open Weather API. Google Maps आपको embed करना है एक website पे. These are examples of web APIs because you are gathering this information from the internet. ठीक है? Because that's your web API. Next up, what do we have? Library APIs. अब ये क्या है? So guys, again, in the context of programming and computers, library means some tool or some क्या बोलते हैं, some package or some software. ठीक है? So what are library APIs? These are APIs which are exposed by libraries or frameworks. ठीक है? Which expose different functionality for developers, right? So देखो, web API पे we were sharing different kinds of data. Library API में क्या हो रहा है? We are exposing different functionalities for developers. ठीक है? मतलब any developer अगर उनको कुछ काम करना है, they do not have to write the complete code from scratch for that. They just need to access the right library and access the right API to leverage that functionality directly, ready-made. ना के writing the entire code from scratch, which can be error prone and time consuming to debug and whatnot, right? Because again, ये देखना, it allows developers to utilize predefined functions or methods without implementing them from scratch. It just makes your life easier, right? अब example, ऐसे कौन से वो libraries हैं which expose their APIs? Because ऐसे तो काफी सारे हैं. To name a few popular ones, of course we have NumPy. Okay, so see, अभी मान लो NumPy तो we have all used basic NumPy, we've done the basic operations. But what if you want to store data using NumPy? You have a NumPy array. What if you want to save it in your system? And आपने save कर लिया. What if you want to load it? What if you want to create a NumPy array with different data type, right? So I'm sure you may not have heard of this, but using NumPy, we can do all of this. And how is that? Using their lower level API. The same thing with TensorFlow too. Uh, Again, guys, if we talk about TensorFlow, most of you might be using Keras. And of course, Keras, by using Keras, we can get 90% of our work done when it comes to building and training and evaluating and visualizing your deep learning models. But again, guys, TensorFlow offers different kinds of APIs. To name a few, sequential API, functional API, subclassing API. They also have a lower level TensorFlow API, which lets you, uh, perform a lot of custom actions, a lot of क्या बोलते हैं, predefined actions. But like if you want to change the way how you interact with TensorFlow, you can use their lower level API as well. And again, Matplotlib too, if you want to implement different kinds of graphs, or if you want to modify the way Matplotlib works altogether, lower level API use करके आप ये कर सकते हैं. So guys, simple words में, there are libraries that let you change a lot of functionality, customization using their dedicated APIs. Okay? Next up, what is remote API? So guys, again, when you say remote, what does remote mean? So you may have heard of the term remote repository, right? When working with Git or GitHub. So remote हुआ क्या यहाँ पे? So remote means somewhere else, not where you are working right now. That's what remote means. वो कहीं और पे है. Remote repository का माना क्या हुआ? एक तो in your laptop you have your local repository and you connect this to a remote repository. So what is that remote repository? That's your GitHub repository, which is where? Hosted somewhere else on the internet, right? So that is what remote means. So what is the remote API? Well, API is designed to interact with those systems which are located on a different network or a server. तो बेसिकली ये क्या बोल रहा है, वो एपीआई विच अलाउज यू इंटरैक्ट विथ सम सॉफ्टवेयर जो कहीं और पे है, दैट इज योर रिमोट एपीआई. सिंपल टर्म्स. ठीक है. तो वेब एपीआई इज अ सबसेट ऑफ रिमोट एपीआई एंड दिस मेक्स अ लॉट ऑफ सेंस, राइट? प्लीज देखना. Example, if you're working on a weather application, you might be hosting your app on some server somewhere on the internet and you want to interact with the weather API. Now, will your app and that weather API ka app, will it be on the same server? Will it be hosted on the same network? No, right? But even then, you are able to interact with it. How is that? So in a broader sense, that is a remote API, right? So guys, that's what remote APIs are. Okay? Because again, ये statement एक देखना, all web APIs are remote APIs, but not all remote APIs are web APIs. Okay? So this is just a concept of which is a subset of what. Okay? So basically, web APIs are a subset of remote APIs. Okay? An example, if you want to deploy virtual machines using your AWS EC2, this is a brilliant example, right? Because, okay, what is EC2? Elastic Container, right? If I'm not wrong. So, I mean, what does it allow you to do? It allows you to perform computations. It allows you to, you know, perform those actions which you would do in your own computer. तो ये हुआ क्या? It becomes a remote computer, right? A computer which is located somewhere else, located on the cloud, on the internet, right? So this is an example of your remote API, things which are somewhere else. Okay? And again, Google Drive is also a very good example. What is Google Drive? It is a storage, right? कहाँ पे store हो रहा है? Is it stored in your local system, in your memory, in your hard drive? No, it is stored somewhere else on the internet, on the cloud, right? So this is your example of remote. Okay? So guys, if that is clear, let's move on to this API. अब ये क्या होता है? Right? Again, APIs that allow applications to interact with databases. ठीक है? So these APIs provide a structured way to perform your CRUD operations, create, retrieve, update, delete. Example, MySQL connector API, right? Guys, I hope you're able to like recall if you have used it or not. Well, matlab, for example, abhi, okay, let's say you are working with Python programming language, right? And you want to use Python to interact with your MySQL database. So how do you do that? You need a link, right? So this MySQL connector is that bridge. Okay? Again, MongoDB API, same thing. Firebase real-time database API, same thing, right? You use one programming language and you want to interact with some database, there is no link, right? Python अपना एक चीज है, database is its own thing. So how can you possibly connect these two? You need some bridge, some pathway, right? So this is where your database API comes into the picture. Okay? So almost every renowned database has its API, which allows different programming languages to interact with itself. Okay? So guys, with that being said, next up, hardware API. ये क्या है? These are those APIs which allows software to interact with physical hardware devices, right? And for example, GPU के APIs हो गए like आपके CUDA, OpenCPL, and your APIs for IoT devices, using APIs to control drones or robots. This is where you would need to interact with physical devices, right? When you talk about robotics or IoT and whatnot. So this is where your hardware APIs become useful. And guys, last up, we have GUI API, Graphical User Interface का API. ये क्या है? No surprise, it's an API designed for building and interacting with graphical user interfaces. It allows developers to create and manage GUI components programmatically, right? For example, Java Swing, Tkinter, Android SDK. तो guys, ये है क्या? What are these, right? So let's say you want to customize, for example, guys, I'll talk about Tkinter. Okay? So let's say you want to make a GUI application, right? You want the end user to, actually interact with some application where they can click on buttons and view the results and everything. And you want to do that using Python. How do you do that? Right? Guys, again, as I told you, right? Python is its own thing. For example, देखना, ये आपका Python हो गया. When I say आपका Python, it means you are writing the code in your laptop. ठीक है? Python, or I'll just call it PY. Python in your local system, right? And what you want to do is you want to make an application. And it has, let's say, a lot of buttons, right? User aa sakta hai, they can click on buttons, they get different information, they get some data showed on the screen. You get the idea, right? You want to make a nice application. How do you do that? Python use karke, we can write code and we get the output on the console, right? But how can you build a GUI application? So guys, again, the answer is Tkinter, right? I'll just write TK. For example, because ये बस एक example था. So Tkinter is that bridge which connects Python to make GUI applications, right? So guys, this was an example of your GUI API. For that same matter, you can connect this example, this diagram over here also. When we spoke about hardware APIs, आपका Python हो गया या C++, any programming language, and you want to, work with IoT devices, your hardware devices, you need some pathway. That is your API. That is all what we are coming to say here. तो ये जो भी है ना, ये जो भी है बीच में, this is an API. That's it, because this is the pathway, right? And ये जो चीज है आपका, this can be anything. If it's a hardware, this API becomes a hardware API. If it's a database, it becomes a database API, right? If it is somewhere on the internet, it becomes a remote API, right? अगर web का कुछ है, it becomes a web API. GUI application, GUI API, right? That's how it works. ठीक है? तो guys, for all intents and purposes, अगर आपको ये structure clear है ना, then you should be good in understanding the different types of APIs. It is the same concept, the same underlying mechanism, right? And we just have different types of it. And how does the type change? The type only changes based on the kind of application, the kind of system, right? If it's a database, if it's a hardware device, if it's a GUI application, if it's something on the web, that is where the type of API changes. But this one will remain the same. Okay? So guys, I hope this gave you a good understanding of what are the different types of APIs. So I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.